happened on that sweltering afternoon at Liberty Memorial began like any other ceremonial day. The sun poured over the expanse of manicured lawns and marble, casting long shadows across the crowd that had gathered to witness the timeless ritual of the silent guard. Families pressed together beneath the weight of the summer heat. Veterans stood rigid with their caps pulled low, and tourists hushed their voices, sensing the reverence demanded by the place. Every sound carried weight, the soft rustle of flags in the breeze, the deliberate echo of boots across the stone, the distant call of birds. This was not just a memorial. It was a sanctuary of sacrifice, where silence itself spoke of lives laid down in anonymity so that others could live in freedom. Among the crowd stood the Mercer family, visiting from the West Coast. Daniel Mercer, a wealthy entrepreneur in the world of finance, scrolled through his phone with the detached air of a man who had grown accustomed to multitasking. Through every moment of life, his wife, Caroline, shaded her eyes with expensive sunglasses, holding a neatly folded program. She glanced at only occasionally. Between them, restless and impatient, stood their only son, Brandon, 14 years old, dressed in trendy sneakers and a designer shirt chosen more for its status than its comfort. He had agreed to this trip not out of interest, but because his parents insisted it would be educational. To him, it was nothing more than another stop on an endless vacation itinerary, just another backdrop for content. The silence that hung over the crowd as the sentinel marched his precise steps meant little to Brandon. He saw no meaning in the measured turns, the unbroken focus, or the ritual that demanded discipline beyond imagination. All he noticed was the monotony, the heat, and the opportunity to create something that would make him stand out online. His phone, already open in his hand, became his window to the moment, not to observe it, but to twist it into entertainment. He whispered under his breath about how ridiculous it all seemed, his voice carrying far enough for a few nearby onlookers to glare. Yet Brandon, like many teenagers who lived for attention, mistook disapproval for fuel. The sentinel on duty that day was Marcus Hale, a 29-year-old member of the Honor Guard, a man forged by service and tempered by personal loss. His older brother, Jonathan, had never returned from deployment overseas, and Marcus had vowed to dedicate his own strength to guarding those whose names would remain forever unknown. Every step he took across that stone platform was heavy with memory and promise. He had spent countless hours perfecting his discipline, training his body and mind to hold steady against any distraction, any provocation, any circumstance. His duty was not simply to march, it was to embody respect itself. The crowd, the restless in the heat, recognized the gravity of the ceremony. Veterans bowed their heads. Children clutched the hands of their parents, and tourists lowered their cameras once they realized they were standing in the presence of something sacred. Only Brandon remained unmoved, shifting from one foot to the other with a look of boredom etched across his face. He raised his phone higher, muttering into the camera about the robot soldier who walked as if programmed. A few in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances, but no one interfered. It wasn't their place, they told themselves, to parent someone else's child. Brandon's moment of mischief arrived when he noticed the half-empty soda can in his grip, condensation sliding down his sides. To anyone else, it would have been nothing more than trash to be tossed into a bin. To Brandon, it became a prop. His lips curled into a grin as he pictured the video's caption, the comments, the laughs from his friends back home. He stepped a little closer to the rope barrier that marked the line between spectators and ceremony, ignoring the warning signs posted clearly at every entrance. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the can tumbling forward. The sound it made when it struck the stone was deceptively soft, a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than thunder in the silence. Sticky liquid sprayed across Marcus's immaculate boots, leaving dark stains against the polished leather. The crowd gasped in unison, the air itself snapping with shock and disapproval. Mothers pulled children closer, veterans clenched their jaws, and tourists froze with wide eyes. The silence that had been sacred was broken, replaced by the weight of outrage and disbelief. Marcus did not flinch. His steps continued, his posture unbroken, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm. He contained. He had been trained to endure distraction. He had endured far worse in battle. Yet this insult, directed not at him alone, but at the memory of all who rested in unmarked graves, pierced deeper than any bullet. His sunglasses hid the fire in his eyes, but those who looked closely could sense the gravity of his restraint. Brandon, however, was delighted. His laughter rang out, harsh against the stunned quiet. As he zoomed in on the soldier's boots with his phone, he declared the scene a triumph, the kind of viral moment that would make him unforgettable online. To him, it was a harmless prank. To everyone else, it was a desecration. An elderly man in the crowd muttered under his breath about respect lost in a younger generation. A woman with a Marine Corps pin shook her head, her lips pressed tight with fury. The air grew heavier with judgment, but Brandon, shielded by his arrogance and his parents' wealth, felt untouchable. He leaned farther over the barrier, mocking the sentinel with words that fell like stones in the silent crowd. For Marcus, the insult was not in the words alone, it was in the presence of the tomb behind him, the monument that represented all who could not speak for themselves. The soda on his boots was not just liquid, it was contempt splashed across memory, sacrifice, and duty. Though he marched on, steady and precise, the line had been crossed. The story that began with a careless toss was about to unfold into something far larger than Brandon could have ever imagined. The crowd at Liberty Memorial had seen disruptions before, a tourist stepping too close, a child speaking too loudly, but nothing like this. Brandon's soda can had done more than stain a soldier's boots. It had fractured the silence, the ritual, the sanctity of the moment. Eyes followed Marcus Hale as he carried on with his measured steps, his rifle angled, his body rigid with control. Every click of his heels against the stone sounded sharper now, like punctuation in a speech no one dared to interrupt. The air was electric, heavy with unspoken anger, and yet the only person oblivious to it was the boy at the center of the storm. Brandon held his phone high, still narrating for an imaginary audience. To him, the moment was comedy, proof that he had cracked the armor of a man who seemed untouchable. He strutted along the barrier, tilting his camera for dramatic effect, announcing his victory as though he were on stage. The crowd's silence, their glares, their shaking heads had all washed over him like background noise. He had been raised in a world where consequences rarely landed. Teachers had looked the other way. His parents had smoothed over every mistake. With money or influence, to Brandon, life was a game without rules, and he was always the winner. But the weight of the place was not lost on everyone. Veterans in the crowd felt fury coil in their chests as they watched the spectacle. To them, this memorial was not an attraction, but a promise etched in marble and silence that those who gave their lives would never be forgotten. They had seen friends buried, names carved into stone, flags folded into triangles and handed to widows. To witness a teenager mocking the sacrifice felt like a slap across generations. An old Navy man leaned toward his wife and whispered through clenched teeth that the boy needed to be taught respect the hard way. Others nodded in grim agreement, though no one moved. They all waited to see what the sentinel would do. Marcus Hale remained steady, his training anchoring him in the moment. He was not just a man in uniform, he was a sentinel, part of an unbroken line that guarded the tomb day and night, in rain and snow, in sweltering heat and bitter cold. His discipline demanded silence in the face of distraction, but inside, his heart pounded. He thought of his brother Jonathan, of the folded flag his family received in place of a homecoming. He thought of the tomb itself, the names lost, the stories untold. Brandon's prank wasn't just childish, it was a wound. Against memory itself, Marcus's steps never faltered, but with each turn, he felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. The boy's antics escalated. He leaned over the rope barrier, mocking the soldier's rigid silence. He called him names, treated him like a prop, and then, in a final act of defiance, stepped across the line entirely. The crowd gasped as his sneaker landed on the stone, reserved for the sentinel's march. It was a transgression so bold that even those who had stayed quiet before now erupted in murmurs of outrage. Phones rose into the air, capturing every angle, ensuring that this act would not remain confined to the memorial, but would soon spill across the digital world. Brandon grinned wide, holding his phone aloft for a triumphant selfie. The guard loomed behind him, unflinching, an immovable figure of discipline and duty. For the boy, it was the perfect shot, the soldier reduced to a backdrop for his performance. He didn't see the fire burning in the eyes behind the dark lenses. He didn't feel the weight of centuries of sacrifice pressing down on that platform. He didn't realize that the game he thought he controlled was already slipping out of his hands. In a motion faster than anyone expected, Marcus stepped forward. His hand moved with precision, not violence, as he snatched the phone from Brandon's grip without hesitation. He dropped it to the stone. The crack of glass echoed like a rifle, shot through the stunned silence. The crowd collectively inhaled, the sharp sound reverberating through the memorial like a warning. Brandon's triumphant grin collapsed into shock. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped, and for the first time that day, he stood speechless. The crowd erupted not in chaos, but in a chorus of whispers and sharp breaths. Some gasped in horror, others smirked in quiet approval. A veteran muttered under his breath that it was about time. Mothers clutched their children tighter, while teenagers exchanged looks of disbelief. What had begun as a prank had turned into a lesson played out before hundreds of witnesses. Brandon's shock quickly gave way to outrage. He pointed at the sentinel, shouting about the cost of the phone, about rights, about unfairness. His voice cracked, high-pitched with indignation, but no one echoed his complaints. His parents finally looked up from their distractions, panic spreading across their faces as they realized the gravity of what had just unfolded. Daniel stormed forward, waving his arms, demanding accountability, threatening legal action. Caroline clung to her son's shoulder, insisting that he was just a child. But the authority at the memorial was not theirs to command. Security officers arrived swiftly, weaving through the crowd with practiced urgency. At their head was Inspector Dana Collins, a seasoned officer who had seen every manner of disturbance in her years of service, but rarely one as blatant as this. Her voice was firm as she ordered the family aside, explaining that Brandon had crossed multiple lines: trespassing, assault, and disrespect of a federal monument. Her tone carried no apology, no hesitation. The Mercer family protested, their outrage loud and theatrical, but the crowd was unmoved. Phones were still recording, capturing every tear, every complaint, every futile argument. The story had already left the memorial. It was racing into the currents of social media, where judgment was swift and merciless. Within minutes, the incident would be everywhere. Through it all, Marcus Hale resumed his post. His boots, still stained with soda, struck the stone in perfect rhythm. His face remained unreadable, but inside he felt both the sting of broken protocol and the conviction that he had defended something greater than himself. He had acted not for pride, but for memory, for Jonathan, for the nameless dead whose silence demanded protection. He carried on, the crowd's whispers fading into the background, his duty unbroken. For Brandon Mercer, the moment was no longer a joke. The shattered phone at his feet, the glares of strangers, and the stern grip of security officers had stripped away his. The Mercer family was escorted from the memorial. Under a wave of murmurs and cameras, the crowd parted reluctantly, some whispering words sharp with anger, others filming every step as if to make certain the boy's humiliation would not be forgotten. Brandon kept his eyes down, though occasionally he darted furious glances at the security officers flanking him. His shattered phone remained behind on the stone, a symbol of the arrogance that had led him here, and of the crack now spreading across his carefully constructed world. Inside the security office, cool air hummed from a vent overhead, but the tension in the room was stifling. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Liberty Memorial through the decades, each one showing a guard in flawless formation, rain or shine, day or night. The images seemed to glare down at Brandon and his parents as they sat across a wide desk from Inspector Dana Collins and Colonel Rachel Monroe, the commanding officer of the Honor Guard unit. Both women carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to discipline and responsibility, and neither was inclined to soften their tone. Dana opened the conversation with a measured recounting of the facts Brandon had thrown an object at a federal sentinel. He had crossed a restricted barrier. He had treated a sacred place as a playground. These were not minor disruptions, she explained. They were violations with serious weight. Daniel Mercer immediately interjected, his voice sharpened by years of boardroom battles. He spoke of lawsuits, of influence, of donations that kept institutions like this afloat. He offered money, as though a check could balance the scale of what his son had done. Caroline clutched her husband's arm and nodded vigorously, insisting that Brandon was only a child, incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. Colonel Monroe did not waver. She reminded them that the memorial was not for sale. It was not a theater where rules bent for the privileged. It was a shrine to sacrifice, guarded by those who bore scars visible and unseen. Her words were clipped, deliberate, carrying the weight of decades of service. She made it clear that Brandon's behavior was not a matter of embarrassment to be covered up, but a breach of respect that demanded accountability. For the first time, Daniel's confidence faltered, his rebuttals falling into silence under the colonel's steely gaze. Brandon slouched in his chair, arms folded, trying to mask his growing unease with feigned indifference. He muttered that it was just a joke, that no one got hurt, that everyone was overreacting. Yet as he glanced around the room, his bravado thinned. The photographs of guards seemed to stare through him, unblinking and unyielding. The weight of their silent expectation pressed down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He felt small, not because of punishment yet delivered, but because he finally sensed the enormity of what he had disrupted. The outside world, however, wasted no time in delivering its own verdict. By the hour, clips of the incident spread across social media. Hashtags began to trend. Hashtag Memorial Disrespect, hashtag Liberty Kid, hashtag Honor Guard. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a parable of privilege colliding with patriotism. Commentators debated on live television whether this was a case of youthful ignorance or the product of failed parenting. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the act, their words heavy with disappointment. For every voice demanding leniency, 10 more called for accountability. Daniel's phone buzzed incessantly, each notification another blow to his reputation. His company's stock began to wobble as investors questioned his judgment. Caroline's social media accounts were flooded with venom, comments from strangers dissecting her parenting and mocking her family's wealth. They had lived for years behind a curtain of influence and control, but now the curtain had been ripped away, exposing them to a public unwilling to forgive. Within the security office, Dana Collins brought in a specialist to assess the boy, not to punish him alone, but to understand what could be salvaged from the wreckage. Dr. Hannah Pierce, a psychologist who had worked with troubled youth, entered with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling outside. She sat across from Brandon, her notebook open, her pen poised, but her eyes steady and unblinking. She asked him not what he had done, but why. At first, Brandon deflected. He shrugged, said he was bored, said it was funny. He insisted that the soldier had not even reacted, as if the guard's discipline excused his own disrespect. But Hannah pressed gently, guiding him with questions that forced him to consider the weight of his actions. Did he know what the tomb represented? Did he understand that the Sentinel was honoring those who would never return home? Did he realize that families came here to grieve, to remember, to heal? Brandon squirmed under the questions, muttering half-hearted answers, but the armor of arrogance was beginning to crack. Hannah explained what the crowd had felt, what veterans saw when they looked at him, what Marcus Hale carried in every step he took. She spoke not in lectures, but in truths, the kind that pierced deeper than scolding ever could. Brandon shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers against his leg, his face flushing. For the first time, the laughter that usually bubbled so easily was gone. He had no clever retort, no audience to cheer him on. He was alone with the weight of his choices. Colonel Monroe and Inspector Collins listened as Hannah gave her recommendation. Brandon needed more than punishment. He needed perspective. She proposed a period of community service at the memorial, itself weeks of labor alongside groundskeepers, of listening to veterans, of standing in the presence of the tomb he had mocked. Only through effort, she argued, could he begin to grasp what he had trampled. If he resisted, the juvenile charges would follow, but this path offered redemption instead of ruin. The Mercers balked at first. Daniel raised his voice about fairness, Caroline wept about ruined vacations, and Brandon groaned as though the sentence were worse than prison. Yet the decision was not theirs to make. Colonel Monroe delivered it with finality. Brandon would serve, and in serving, he would learn. The weight of her words was unassailable. Her authority rooted not in wealth or influence, but in sacrifice. Brandon sat in silence, his head lowered, his phone gone, his status stripped bare. For the first time in his young life, he understood that the world would not always bend for him. The room felt colder, heavier, and yet within it lay a chance not just for punishment, but for change. Bravado. For the first time, he began to realize that he was not untouchable. The prank he thought would make him famous was about to do exactly that, but not in the way he imagined. The next morning, Brandon Mercer's transformation began. At dawn, long before his friends back home would have stirred from sleep, he was handed a pair of work gloves, a plain shirt, and a list of tasks that seemed endless. His designer sneakers had been replaced with boots that blistered his feet. The manicured grounds of Liberty Memorial became his classroom, every path swept, every stone polished, every blade of grass trimmed a lesson in humility. Under the gaze of veterans who had seen war and loss firsthand, Brandon learned quickly that his complaints found no audience. The men and women he worked beside did not care about his family's wealth, his social following, or his excuses. They cared about respect, and they expected him to show it. At first, Brandon bristled. He muttered under his breath as he pushed brooms across hot pavement. He scowled as he hauled bags of clippings from the cemetery grounds. Each sunrise felt like punishment, each hour beneath the Virginia sun like an eternity. But the veterans, supervising him, did not scold. They worked in silence, steady and relentless, their hands calloused, their bodies marked by scars visible and hidden. When they spoke, it was only to share a story, a memory of friends who never returned, of nights spent in foreign lands under fire, of flags draped over coffins. Brandon listened reluctantly at first, then with growing quiet. Their words were not for pity. They were truths carried on their backs for decades. One afternoon, he met Eleanor Grant, a 91-year-old nurse who had served in Korea. She sat beneath a tree, her cane at her side, her voice trembling with age but steady with conviction. She told him about boys not much older than he had been when they were brought to her. Wounded and afraid, clinging to life, she told him how they fought not for fame, not for reward, but for one another, for ideals larger than themselves. Brandon stood beside her, holding a rake, unable to find words. For once, silence felt appropriate. By the second week, something began to shift. Brandon no longer counted the minutes until his day ended. He stopped reaching for a phone that was no longer there. His body grew stronger from the labor, but more importantly, his perspective stretched. Each name etched into a headstone ceased to be a symbol and became a story, a person, a life given. He began to feel the weight of the place, not as a burden, but as an honor. When he swept pathways, he thought of the families who would walk them, searching for solace. When he polished the marble, he thought of the reflection of a flag that might someday drape across it. The third week brought a ceremony that seared itself into his memory. He stood in the crowd once more, this time not as a mocking observer, but as a participant in reverence. The sentinel marched with precision, the silence surrounding the tomb unbroken. And Brandon felt a tightness in his chest he could not explain. He saw Marcus Hale again, every step deliberate, every motion flawless. It struck him then with sudden clarity. The man he had mocked carried the weight of his brother's sacrifice with each movement. The tomb was not a performance, it was a promise. Brandon felt his throat close as he realized the depth of his disrespect. On the final day of his service, Brandon was called into a quiet office overlooking the cemetery. Colonel Monroe and Dr. Hannah Pierce sat at a long table, and across from them sat Marcus Hale, no longer in uniform, but carrying the same disciplined presence. That made him seem larger than the room itself. Brandon's stomach churned as he lowered himself into the chair, his palms damp, his heart hammering. He expected anger, perhaps even condemnation. What he found was steadiness. Brandon spoke first. His voice trembled, but did not falter. He admitted his arrogance, his thoughtlessness, his hunger for attention. He confessed that he had not seen Marcus as a person, nor the tomb as sacred, but only as props in a performance meant for likes and comments. He said he now understood, through stories and sweat, what sacrifice meant. He thought of his grandfather, once a Marine, and realized how deeply he had dishonored his memory. The words were difficult, but they were true. Marcus listened without interruption. His expression remained unreadable, though his eyes softened slightly as Brandon spoke. When the boy finished, Marcus leaned forward and told his own story. He spoke of Jonathan, the brother who had never returned, of the nights spent waiting for news that never came, of the folded flag that now sat in his family's home as both honor and wound. He explained why he marched, why discipline mattered, why silence at the tomb was not emptiness but reverence. His words cut through Brandon's defenses and planted themselves firmly in his conscience. When Marcus extended his hand, Brandon took it. The grip was firm, unyielding, but not hostile. It was a gesture not of forgiveness alone, but of acknowledgement that Brandon had begun to learn that redemption was possible. For the first time, Brandon felt as though he was being seen not as a spoiled child, but as someone capable of respect, of change, of carrying forward the lesson carved into stone and memory. In the weeks that followed, the story of the boy at Liberty Memorial transformed. What began as a tale of disrespect captured on shaky phone footage evolved into a narrative of redemption. News outlets covered his service, his meetings with veterans, his quiet apology to the man he once mocked. The hashtag shifted. Hashtag Liberty Kid gave way to hashtag Lesson in Honor. Brandon himself began to write, sharing the stories he had heard, the lessons he had learned, hoping that others his age might understand before making the mistakes he had made. His parents, chastened by the glare of public judgment, sought to change as well. Determined to raise their son not with indulgence, but with responsibility, Marcus Hale returned to his duty, his boots polished once more, his steps unbroken. The soda stains had long been scrubbed away, but the memory of that day lingered. He carried it with him, not as a scar, but as proof that honor, though fragile, could still be taught. The tomb remained as it always had, a silent guardian of sacrifice, a reminder that some things are sacred, and that even a careless act can be transformed into a lifelong lesson.